Good morning. Time for the last presentation of the day. This is a rather technical presentation, and we're going to talk about JavaScript. I always find these things interesting, and I hope, given the fact that you are watching this, that you do as well. So, I thought a little bit about how I can make the topic clear, because it has the capacity to be a little bit confusing, I believe. And I'm going to do it a little bit differently. And actually what I'm going to do, first of all, is a little demo of two small things that are possible, and then something that with pdfToolbox 12 would not be possible in the way that I'm showing it. And then we're going to look at the theory behind it and how it actually is implemented. So what am I going to do? Well, I've taken a use case that we encountered at some point in a previous project. Not exactly the same, but similar. And I want to implement that. And the question that we encountered was, how do I make a Preflight check that looks for certain spot colors, for the existence of certain spot colors, but I don't know ahead of time what the spot colors are, and I don't even know how many spot colors I want to check for. Yeah? And I still want to have a Preflight check for each of these individual spot colors. And of course, I want a good Preflight message, error message for them as well. So that is kind of the problem. And you can approximate that with pdfToolbox 12 and before, but you can't really implement it perfectly well. And of course, as you can guess, with pdfToolbox 13, that is now possible, and I'm going to show you how. That is the goal. So let me go away from my presentation for a second, and then I need pdfToolbox. I have a file here. This is a fake packaging file. That is not important. The only important thing is that there are a number of spot colors in here that I can play with. Yeah, I have something that is gold. Some of the blue things you see in there are actually gold and gold emboss. I also have a cut spot color and a fold spot color, and then some Pantone colors in there as well. So what can I do with pdfToolbox 12 when it comes to checking these things? Well, the first thing I can do, and that is what you see at the top here of, let me zoom in a little bit, is what you see at the top here is I can of course check for a single spot color, and that is not very exciting. Let me show that. So if I run this, it tells me you have a spot color gold, and it is used on 35 objects. And how do I do that? Well, I do that by checking. I'm using a condition here, spot color name, and if spot color name is equal to gold, then I give a Preflight error. So for one spot color, I have no problem, of course. And this gold that I put in here, that could be a variable, so it can come from outside the application, and I can make it dynamic. What if it's multiple spot colors? In that case, I can also do things. And I have an example here. I will run it first, and when I run it, my Preflight error message is now spot color is in list of technical colors, and I have 112 matches. And if I show you how that is implemented, it is still not very exciting. I have a spot color name is contained in lists, and then I listed all of the spot colors that I'm interested in. Let's be clear that gold and gold emboss would not be technical colors. I'm just using this as an example. Yeah. So this is possible. And again, this list that I have here, this gold, cut, fold, and so on, that could be a variable, and that could come from outside. So can I check for spot colors if I don't know ahead of time what they are? Yes, I can. Can I check for a number of spot colors that I don't know ahead of time which ones? Yes, I can do that as well. So all of those things are not a problem. What I cannot do is dynamically create individual pre-flight checks for each of these, and then also report correctly what the spot color is and how many items were found and so on. That is much more difficult. And actually there is no good way of doing that in pdfToolbox 12. Now I'm going to run the last example here, well, the last for now, and I called that artificial check for spot colors. And when I run that, something kind of strange happens. In fact, I get 4 items in my result view, 2 of which are reported as an error, gold emboss and gold, and 2 others that are reported as a warning, cut and fold. And you can see that for each of these items, I have the correct number of matches. Well, you don't know that this is the correct number of matches for each of these spot colors, but trust me, it is. And if you would count all of these together, you would have the same amount of hits as for the for the technical colors example that I showed you before. So I ran one pre-flight check. And if you know a little bit how pdfToolbox works and how checks work and so on, this should be really strange because I ran one pre-flight check and I get 4 items in my result window. And even stranger, I get 2 that are reported as error and then 2 warnings. Normally, if you run an individual check, pdfToolbox just tells you whether there is a hit or no hit, and it's always reported as an error. The ability to set the severity level, as it's called, to warning or information exists in a profile or in the process plan, but not in an individual check. So how do we get this? Well, I will tell you. Let's go back to the presentation, and then I need to set this full screen again. And let's look at the theory behind this. Of course, this is something new in pdfToolbox 13 that has been added. And I'm going to give you now a little bit of the theory of what happens and how this works. And then we're going to go back to 2 examples in pdfToolbox to show how this works in pdfToolbox itself. But some theory first. The way this has been implemented is using a condition. Again, if you know something about pdfToolbox, then a pre-flight check is normally built out of 1 or more conditions, and these together determine whether there is a hit or no hit. This condition is a bit strange. It crosses some boundaries. Yeah? Why? Because it is a condition that will allow me to create things on the fly, dynamically. How does it work? Well, this condition can add conditions to the current check. So I can make a pre-flight check and then use this condition to dynamically create additional conditions that are going to end up in my current check. Or, as in the example I just shown, it can on the fly create completely new checks that are then run by pdfToolbox. It's conceptually similar to something that was introduced last year, and that is the arbitrary JavaScript controlled fixups. Arbitrary JavaScript controlled fixups is a fixup where you can write some JavaScript and again dynamically create other fixups that are then run by pdfToolbox. And this is very similar to that. The way that works is also very similar. You have to write JavaScript, and you can essentially write whatever JavaScript you want, but in the end of your JavaScript, there needs to be an object, and that object must follow a specific structure, and you pass that object back to pdfToolbox, which then interprets it and then automatically creates either conditions or checks or both. So the way this works is exactly the same, and what we need to look at here to understand how it works is what is this return object, and what do we need to put in there so that pdfToolbox understands what we're talking about. The result object or return object is a regular JavaScript object. It just needs to have certain properties. And its basic structure is like this. You can implement this in different ways if you want to, but what you have here is an object. I've called it result. It can have any name you want as long as you return it in the end. This one is called result, and it has two properties. One called conditions and the other one called checks. And as you can see, both of them in my example are empty arrays. In reality, one or the other or both of these arrays would have to contain information. Otherwise, this would be an empty thing, and that is not very useful. But so I create an object. I put in something that is called checks or conditions or both, and then I make sure that pdfToolbox receives it. pdfToolbox will interpret it and then do something with the information. If there is something in the conditions array, the property called conditions here, if there is something in the conditions array, then it must be a well-formed condition object, and I will explain in a second what that is. If that is the case, that condition is added to the current check, and so when that check is run, you now have one or more additional conditions, and you can put as many conditions in that array as you want. If you put something in the checks array, then that must be a well-formed check object. And again, if there is something in there, pdfToolbox will interpret each of these things in that checks array. It will assume it is a valid object, create a check for it, and then run the check. So let's look at these two things independently. And we're going to start with the simplest one, how to dynamically add conditions to a check. And then we already know how to do that. We need this result object, and that has that property called conditions, and that is an array, and then I need to put condition objects in that array. The only thing we don't know yet or didn't know yet was how does such a condition object look? And here you have an example. And one thing that is common to every type of condition object, if you want, is that it has to have, this is a bit confusing to say at least, it has to have a property that is named property. That's what you see on the first line there. And that property tells pdfToolbox which condition you're interested in. And as you can see, there is a property here in the color group, and that property is identified as spot color name. If you would search in the condition list in your check editor and you type in spot color name, then you would find this one. This particular condition needs an operator and a value. Because you want to look at the spot color name, and then you want to be able to, for example, say unequal to, or is contained in list, or is equal to. So that is the operator. That's the second property I need to add in order for pdfToolbox to understand what I'm talking about. And then, of course, I need a value because I want to compare the spot color name of an element to something. And that something is the value, and in my example here, that is gold. Okay, so let's go back to pdfToolbox because it's more fun to show you how it works there. And I've prepared an example, actually the example that I had on the slide as well. And what we're going to do, so first of all, I can run this. And then it asks me, what spot color are you interested in? And I will say cut. And when I run that, come on, thank you. When I run that, it gives me a message that says spot color cut is used, 37 matches on one page. It's not very exciting. It does exactly the same thing as the first example I had here, except that I added a variable, but I want to just show how this works. And now it gets much more exciting because I don't have just a simple condition here. What I have here is a bunch of JavaScript that does things. So let's look in a little bit of detail at what happens here. First of all, when you're writing this JavaScript, I am in the normal JavaScript environment, which means that if you've written JavaScript in process plans or in profiles, for example, well, you can do the same thing here. So I can use, as an example, app.requires to tell pdfToolbox that there is a variable that I need. And that is exactly what happens here. I declare a variable var spot color name, and I am going to ask pdfToolbox to get a value for this for me. And that is why when I run this check, it asks me, what's the spot color name you're interested in? And then you see the structure I already had in my slides as well, yeah, where it says, I'm going to declare a result object, and that result object has one property in this case. The property is called conditions. So I want to create dynamic conditions. And at the end of the script in line 23, I return that result object to pdfToolbox. In between, I have result conditions push, which adds a new element to my conditions array. And what I put in there is, and it will be more clear if I put it on separate lines perhaps. Yeah. So what I put in there is an object starting on line 11 and to line 14. It's an object that has a property and that has an operator. And then I'm doing the same a little bit lower with a second condition. So I'm going to end up with a conditions array that has two conditions in it. Which conditions? Well, the second one we already saw on the slide, that is the spot color name equal to, and then the variable, because that's the one that I'm interested in. Yeah? The first condition we hadn't seen. It is not strictly necessary. It is here because this way I can show you that how different properties look and different conditions look, and that you can add multiple. This condition is also in the color group, and it is called here is spot color name. If you search the condition list in pdfToolbox, you will find that as well. It only has an operator. The condition is called is spot color, and I can set it to is true or is false. And in this case, I'm setting it to is true. Yeah? So I create two condition objects. I add those to that array, and then I return that result object to pdfToolbox, and that's it. So what happens when I execute this? Well, what happens is that pdfToolbox is going to look at this script that I have here. It's going to see that there is a variable defined in there. So it's going to ask the user for a spot color, first of all. But it also sees that there is a result object with conditions in it. So those conditions will be created dynamically. They are added to the Preflight check that I have here. And when I run this Preflight check, I now have something with these two conditions in it. If I wanted to limit this to text, for example, or to vector elements, probably a better example. Yeah? How do I do that? Well, I would need to add a third condition to my lists, and that third condition would have to be something with vector objects. And that brings up an interesting point, of course. I have this thing here, CS color is spot color. I have CS color spot color name. How do you know what to use here? If I now want to add something to check for, to check only vector objects, how do I know how to do that? Well, there are multiple ways to do it, and you can find all of them under this little information button. And there you see open list of all base checks, and that gives you the definition of all base checks and 2 items to insert a check. That probably doesn't work the way you envision it right now, so I will show you what the deal is. So first of all, let's click on this list of all base checks. And that is going to, in my browser, open a very long document with a definition of everything that you can use in terms of checks and conditions and operators and so on and so on. Yeah? And this shows you all the different operators you can use for a particular condition, for example, and that can be quite useful, but it's not my preferred way of going about this. I will show you something else. So I'm going to put myself at the end of my script and give myself some space. And then I can say insert base check or insert configured. Let's start with configured. That brings up this nice dialog. You've already seen this in one of the sessions from Dietrich before. Yeah, and that allows me to search for a check that already exists, either in the library I'm currently in, maybe in all libraries or in a different library. And then you can see that I have 2 checks that have spot color in it. And if I select one of them and I say add, I get this added to my JavaScript. So pdfToolbox looks at the check that I have in my library, and it gives me the JavaScript that corresponds exactly to that check. And in there you see the conditions list for that check. Yeah? And now, of course, I could copy this into what I want. So this works with configures checks, but that is not what I am interested in or was looking at here, because what I wanted to do was also have a condition for vector objects, and I don't happen to have a configured check with vector in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose base check, insert base check, and that gives me a new check editor. Yeah? And here I can now say, oh, vector, I think this is vector, if I'm not mistaken, so I can add that. Yeah, and I should add it only once. And then I say is true. So I added a condition that says is vector object is true. And once I have the condition that I'm interested in, I'm just going to OK it. I haven't changed anything else, so that is fine. And pdfToolbox now gives me a check that has that condition that I'm interested in. So I could copy that. And then in what I was building before, I can add it in exactly the same way. Conditions, push, and then the condition that I just picked up. And if I want to be nice and satisfy my OCD, I will add a semicolon there, and this can go. Yeah. So instead of having to know by heart what these property strings are and what all the rest of this stuff is, I can do 2 things. I can pick up a check that already exists and ask pdfToolbox to give me the JavaScript for that check, or I can say insert base check, and then I can configure the conditions that I want, and those I can also get as JavaScript. And then you just copy paste the pieces that you're interested in, And when I add that, it is now going to be limited to vector objects. So all of a sudden, I no longer have 2 conditions in my array, but now I have 3. And when I run it, it is going to give me what is one trick. If you make mistakes, you are going to make mistakes. I know because I make them very often myself when I'm doing stuff like this. If you save this Preflight check and I run it here and I made a mistake, then I'm going to get probably a dialog box that says, this doesn't work. This is an invalid property or something like that. And it doesn't really give you much information to work with. Instead, what I can do is I can run this in test mode. And when I run it in test mode, so it asks me for the variable. When I run it in test mode, pdfToolbox does the same thing. It tries to build your check and then run it. But if now there is a mistake in your JavaScript or something like that, the error message that pdfToolbox encounters while trying to parse your JavaScript is going to appear in your result window. And that means that this time, if you run it this way, you will get at least an indication of what went wrong and where it went wrong. Yeah? In my case, I actually didn't get a mistake, so apparently what I did here was still okay. Yeah? But remember that if you want to write things like that and you have an error somewhere, just running the check isn't going to help very much. But if you use the test environment, then you're going to get a developer type error, but at least you're going to be able to see what might have gone wrong in that JavaScript. So that could be very helpful. Okay, so that is the first thing that we could do. This is adding conditions to an existing check in a dynamic way. As I said, you can use the I button to find these conditions by either looking at the list or inserting checks and so on. So pretty straightforward in the end. Yeah? Not trivial, but pretty straightforward. The second example is a little bit more complex. It is more difficult in my head because it violates some of the boundaries that I thought I understood for pdfToolbox. Like I said, you run one check and all of a sudden you get 4 things in this result window, and you get warnings which shouldn't be possible if you run an individual check and so on. But from a conceptual point of view and from a JavaScript point of view, it is very, very similar to what you just saw. So if you could follow along with what we just did with these conditions, this shouldn't be much more difficult. The difference is, well, I still have this result object that I have to fill and then pass back to pdfToolbox. Yeah? The only difference is, this time I'm going to put stuff in the checks array, not in the conditions array. And that means I need a check object. And actually, you have already seen check objects. If we do insert base check or insert configure check, what I did in my previous example, then that is a check object that is inserted in my JavaScript by pdfToolbox. Yeah? What I have here on the slide is a minimal version of that. I have conditions in there, which is what builds a check, and I have put a name in there, which is what is going to be reported as a Preflight error, the severity, and in this case, I have some condition logic. In a check, when you create a check in the editor, on the left-hand side, there is this checkbox. There are actually a number of checkboxes that you can set to determine logic, and one of them is report hit if any condition met, and that determines whether you have an and or an or in between conditions. Well, that you can set here with this condition logic property. Yeah? So all the things that you can normally set in a check in the user interface, I now have properties for so that I can configure them in my or using JavaScript. So when I then return to my original demo, remember that we ran this and we got 4 items here, 2 errors and 2 warnings. We can now examine what that does because we have all the information necessary to understand it. And it looks a little bit, it is a little bit longer because I'm not creating conditions, I'm creating check objects, and these check objects are have more properties, so they're a little bit more complex, but conceptually this is still the same. In my example, what I've done is I have defined a list with the spot colors that I'm interested in, but of course this could be a variable and come in from the outside, or it could be something in the file that I look at to determine which spot colors there are and so on. Yeah? But for this demo, I decided to make a simple list. And in my list are 5 items. And then you could ask, there are 5 items in this list. Why didn't you see 5 items in the result window? Because we only had 4. Well, in my list, I have a spot color named silver, and my file doesn't contain silver. It only contains gold. So there was a Preflight check built for silver as well, but there were no hits for it, and so it doesn't appear in the result window. What do I have in my list? The names of the spot color, and then whether I consider them to be an error or a warning. And you can see that I listed cut and fold as a warning and the other 3 as an error. This has nothing to do with production logic or pre-press logic or whatsoever. This is just my demo to show what you can accomplish. So these are the things we're interested in, and then I have a result object. The result object now doesn't have my conditions array, but it has a checks array. Yeah? And when I scroll to the end of the script, you'll see that that result object here is passed back to pdfToolbox, exactly the same as what we did before. The second thing I do here is I define a template for a check. This is the check that I want to work with. In this case, I created that check by importing a configured check. Yeah? I have a check for spot color, so I asked pdfToolbox to insert the JavaScript for that one, and that gives me something with all the properties that I want. And here you can really see all the properties that you can set for a check. Yeah? The same ones as I had before, the condition logic, the conditions itself, the name, but now also, for example, comment, which is the description of a check. And I could insert things like severity level and the scope. And the scope is, for example, also what you see on the left-hand side of the check editor. There you could say things like, do you want to check the current document? Do you want to check the embedded PDFs in this PDF file? Am I interested in processing steps, yes or no? So all of these things that you normally set in the UI. So this is the check that I want to run for each of the items in my lists. And so what the rest of this example does is it runs over that list of spot colors that I'm interested in. And then for each of them, it creates a clone of my template object, my template check. So it creates a clone, and then it replaces in this copy that I create, it replaces the name of the spot color and the severity level that was associated with that spot color. And it does that in a number of places because I want to have the spot color name in the conditions. I want to have it in the custom ID for that check. I want to have it in the name, which is what is reported in the result window and or in the Preflight report. And I want to have it in the severity. I want my severity level to appear in the severity level of my copy here. And then I add that copy into my checks array. The fact that I have a list here and that I then run over whatever, that could all be different. The only thing that you have to make sure of is that in the checks property, you end up with check objects that are valid and that pdfToolbox knows how to deal with. When this check is run, it is inserted. All these things that are created in the checks array are created as checks, and they are inserted into what pdfToolbox is running. Now here I am running it independently. So when I run this, I get what we saw before, which is just 4 checks, 4 results. If I would insert my check into a profile, that would function in exactly the same way. So my profile has 15 checks in it. It also has this one inside. Well, that check is going to additionally create 5 spot color checks, and those are going to be inserted in the profile, the list of things that is executed by the profile, and it's going to be run. And the results I'm going to get are the results of all of the normal checks in the profile plus what is created dynamically. So if you want to, you could have a profile that has only 1 check, and that 1 check uses JavaScript to create a long list of things you want to check for, but all dynamically. And you could do the same thing for fixups. Maybe also a last point is that these are really checks that are created and executed. And that means that they behave in the same way as a normal check would behave. So if I have a process plan and I want to run a check, and then I want to use JavaScript to inspect the results of that check and do something with them, then that is going to work. It's going to work with a normal check. It is also going to work with this check that dynamically creates other stuff. It behaves completely normal, so the results end up in the app.results object, and I can inspect them using JavaScript in the next step of the process plan. There are no limitations introduced by the fact that these things are created on the fly. So, I think that this is what I wanted to explain. I hope you can see that this can be very, very powerful. I on purpose selected an example that, or 2 examples that are relatively simple, so you can see how these things are constructed and what the principles behind it are. But it's obvious that you can do much more complex things with these as well. If you want to have a look, well, you have access to pdfToolbox 13 already. There is documentation for this. If you go to help.callassoftware.com and you go to the manual for pdfToolbox 13. So feel free to experiment and see whether you can get this to work or not. And if you have any questions about it, you can either ask them now or play with it, and then when questions come up, come back to us and ask, and we will be happy to help.